Welcome to the Next Pivot Point podcast. This season, I am focused on sharing stories and ideas from global experts on diversity and inclusion. My purpose is to share diverse stories so that you can learn from others' lived experiences and walk away with actionable strategies to lead even more inclusively. I share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Next Pivot Point, I believe we are stronger together as allies. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome to the Next Pivot Point podcast. This week, I am joined with another diversity expert, Amanda Davie. She's an executive and leadership coach, co-founder of Equal Talent, a seasoned entrepreneur and business leader. Amanda helps organizations and leaders to build more emotionally intelligent, inclusive, and collaborative skills in order to create teams and workplaces where everyone feels psychologically safe, where they feel like they belong, and where they can perform at their best. How refreshing. Amanda is a passionate egalitarian and feminist, and her professional mission is to help make the world of work a more diverse, fair, and rewarding place for everyone. As such, Amanda is best known for her work with marginalized and underrepresented individuals and groups, i.e., women, BAME, new acronym for our listeners, at least our domestic listeners here, LGBTQ plus, and parents, with the courageous boards and C-suites who want to reverse the deeply entrenched bias that limits their leaders and organizations from achieving their full potential. Amanda, I'm so excited to talk with you today.
Thank you for having me, Julie.
Well, tell our listeners, how did you get into this space for diversity? I always find the backstory, the personal journey through your own lived experiences and then claiming your own space, your own business around it. Tell us how you got here.
It's a good question, isn't it? I think there's on the surface how I came to be here, and then there's the more deep-rooted stuff, which I think I'm still working through at the ripe old age of 47. I had a thriving career in digital media for 16 years, had immense fun, made some money along the way, and I always loved being part of building something, building a team, building a startup business. And whilst we were selling digital media and marketing services, I was less interested in the technical side of it, and really passionate about selling the talent that we had, these highly talented digital natives. So I guess my journey into becoming a coach, and then working in the diversity, inclusion and belonging space started with a love of people. And prior to that, just a curiosity of people. I've always been one of those people who is too nosy for their own good, always really interested in what makes people tick. And when I started my coaching training, that was my first foray into psychology. I'd never studied it at school or college. And I was like a kid in a sweet shop. I could not believe the breadth and depth of the field of psychology, this understanding that we have, spanning millennia, as to what makes us tick, how our minds work, why we are who we are. And I think for most of us, we spend most of our lives never really fully answering that question for ourselves. So it's a constant line of inquiry. And I love the fact that it is such a growth medium and space and field.
I know there's always something to learn, isn't there? Which is fun. And then you're like, I have to keep reading these books. I have to keep listening to these podcasts. I have to keep at it, because we're always going to be on this journey for something that's so far reaching, like inclusion. I'm curious, your bio, and I know your expertise deep in psychology and in emotional intelligence. I often say emotional intelligence is a big skill that we need in our allies and our inclusive leaders. Why is emotional intelligence so important to leading inclusively?
So, emotional intelligence at its core is an understanding of ourselves, and then applying that understanding to managing ourselves better. And it's an understanding of others, and then applying that learning to managing others. So, as I'm explaining it in that sense, you can start to see the implications for managers and leaders in business. It starts with the core skill of self-awareness, which is the piece of work that starts where coaching starts. And so a lot of coaches now are applying their coaching skills to helping managers and leaders to develop their emotional intelligence skill set. I work with a particular framework, which was developed by a company called Roche Martin, which has 10 competencies in it. And I'm probably going to do them a massive disservice now by trying
You
to
can name just a few. That's fine. I know what that's like to be put on the spot, and 10's a lot to remember.
There are 5 selves. I always remember that bit. So self-awareness, we've talked about. Self-control, which is a big challenge for so many people. We're being triggered constantly in the workplace. Self-actualization, which is about the bigger picture stuff, what matters to us, our values, our purpose, our philosophy, and also the work-life integration piece. So how we make meaning of work, and using all of that knowledge and wisdom to keep ourselves balanced as managers and leaders. We've got adaptability, we've got empathy, relationship skills, optimism, to name a few of those skills. And thank you for letting me off the hook with the others.
No, those are so important. I mean, when you're thinking about I call it like your ally inventory, how do you want to show up as an inclusive leader? Things like vulnerability, empathy, like you said, self-awareness, understanding how to show up as an ally at work and at home. Like there's no on and off switch, especially in a world where you're probably working from home, maybe.
Yeah.
And showing up. And emotional intelligence, I find it's interesting, is it's kind of this self-awareness lens, like you said, and then this I have to manage my behavior lens, and I'd be aware, and I also have to do things to manage those triggers, because our workplace is full of triggers, things that set off alarm bells, and our amygdala starts firing, right? And that fight or flight mode that was helpful back when we were getting hunted by the saber-toothed tiger is not helpful when you just can't get something to print or you get a bad email. But our brain still treats that trigger, that threat, very much the same way. So I'm curious, Amanda, when you feel those triggers in the workplace, the bad email, feedback, meeting goes bad, like whatever it happens, whatever your triggers are, how do you help leaders understand, like, what can they do when their emotions are really hard to manage?
There are a number of different strategies. I think fundamentally, we have to understand how the brain works. So the fact that, we are looking for danger all the time. So we are on red alert, and it's very easy to trigger our threat response system. Also, in terms of how our brains work, we are looking to keep safe in tribes, people like us. So this is really important for the diversity and inclusion piece. What we have to realize is that there are parts of our brain that are very old and that no longer serve us particularly well in our modern environments like the workplace. So we have to learn strategies to override our natural brain's disposition. So, for example, instead of fight, flight, or freeze, we have to learn to let it go. So if any of your listeners have done any cognitive behavioral therapy work, those are the strategies and tactics of catching ourselves and our limiting beliefs and our beliefs and our unhelpful thoughts, and reframing those into more positive ones, and then adapting our behavior, changing our behavior based on that reframing. So there are strategies that we can do to manage our levels of self-control and to not be triggered. I think the skill that is probably the most important in that emotional intelligence toolkit for the modern day workplace is empathy. People think that empathy is something that you either innately have or you don't, and that's not true. It's a skill, and you can learn it, you can develop it, you can master it. The exception being unless you are diagnosed as a psychopath. So empathy starts with listening. And we could spend half an hour, Julie, you and I could rant and rave about how woefully bereft the workplace is of listening skills. And in my case,
so not to interrupt you and not listen, but isn't it so sad how little empathy exists in the modern workplace?
Yeah. But yeah, I've got two young kids. I've got a 7 and 8-year-old, and doing the whole homeschooling piece at the moment. And just earlier, they were on a Zoom class with their teacher, and they have a great rapport with this teacher. She's very young and vibrant and dynamic. So they see her as a peer. They kept interrupting her constantly. And so I'm in the background saying, please let Sam finish. Please listen to Sam. Please don't interrupt her until she's finished her sentence. I don't know about you, Julie, but in all your years of working in corporate, you have been in that meeting where people talk over one another, sometimes with the best of intentions. There's a pause, there's a gap, probably because somebody's thinking and somebody else dives in to help them. Sometimes it's with less good intent. It's listening to get their point across, to get their voice heard. So in the group coaching spaces that we create, we always invite our coaches to agree to a certain set of behaviours, and these are inclusive behaviours that are very easy to translate to those meeting rooms and to other interventions in the workplace. No interruption, equal share of voice, no judgment, no cynicism, unconditional positive regard. They're just really simple, but they start in childhood. That's why I bring my children up. If we have, I say to my children, how many ears do you have and how many mouths do you have? Okay, that's a 2-to-1 ratio. We have to apply that 2-to-1 ratio in our relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And learning that skill early to listen versus speak is so critical, because you and I spend a lot of time in corporate settings where you have to unlearn that negative behavior of talking before you listen. And I always remind myself, a couple of things on listening, and I'd love for you to build off of this, Amanda, with your expertise. Remind myself when I'm listening, it actually expends a lot more energy than speaking, because I'm learning something new. So my brain's having to take in new information, filter it, make sense of it, compartmentalize it, categorize it, all that stuff. And when I'm sharing something, I already know. So I'm just regurgitating. So it's actually easier to talk than to listen.
Yeah.
And then the other piece is when I'm talking, I'm not learning anything new. So to remind myself, if I'm speaking, I already know the thing I'm going to share. Unless I'm having some revelation or something. But for the most part, when I'm listening, I'm learning something new. And would I rather learn something new or hear something I've already known before? So it kind of gets me in the curiosity mindset. Curious about other listening strategies for our listeners to listen better.
So one exercise we do in our group coaching circles is an exquisite listening exercise. So listening with ears, and ears is an acronym. So listen, E is for empathy, A is for acknowledgement, R is for reflect, and S is for summarize. So first of all, You listen with empathy, no interrupting, and you're gathering that data and you're learning. And you're trying to put yourself in that other person's shoes. Crucially, this is the key part to empathy building. So as that person is telling you what's going on for them, you are imagining cognitively and emotionally what it is like to be them. So E for empathy, A for acknowledgement. So that could just be, yeah, I hear you. I agree. Reflect. So that's the processing piece, but also you can reflect by picking out keywords and playing them back to the other person. So letting them know that you're processing, really important for connection and engagement. And then S, summarize. So let me get that clear. Can I just check, play this back to you so that I've got it right? Gives the other person an opportunity to adjust your understanding if you haven't quite got it right. But most importantly, it tells them that they've been heard. Super powerful.
Oh, yeah, because there's nothing more powerful than being heard. And when we talk about inclusion in the workplace, it's being seen, it's being heard, and it's feeling a sense of belonging. And if people aren't listening to you, it's a huge sign that you're not heard. And therefore, maybe you don't feel a sense of belonging and you don't feel like people are fully seeing you. So, oftentimes, when I'm talking about allyship, number one attribute is listening. So, I think it also, when you tie it to diversity, if you don't by nature understand what it's like to be the other person because they have an attribute that you have not yourself experienced, it really opens up for listening and being curious because there's something they know that you don't. And when you think about what it means to be an ally and be inclusive, I think why listening is so fundamental is because you haven't lived those experiences, your only choice really is to listen. And you'll learn something new on the other side of it. So there's actually a benefit to listening, and you don't have to have the answers, which, especially when I'm communicating with white men about allyship, they're like, phew. Like, I don't have to know what it's like to be a woman in the workplace. I don't have to know what it's like to be a person of color. I don't have to know what it's like to be an LGBTQ person. How could I know if I haven't experienced that? Maybe I have a friend or a family member or a coworker that's close to me that's experienced that, but I still haven't lived that same experience. So this ears model, I think, is really helpful to make sure that you're listening, practicing empathy, affirming, reflecting. What is the S again? Summarizing. Oh, let's see. I'm learning from listening. I just played that back, reflected it back. That's how we learn, by the way, is our brains have to hear things several times for it to really soak in. So Amanda, I'm curious, thinking about the world, hopefully, as we're moving towards post-pandemic or whatever it looks like on the other side of this. There's no normal to go back to. I think we all know that. How has this impacted diversity globally? What are you seeing, and what do you hope we see on the other side of this?
Well, so I don't consider myself to be a diversity expert per se. So I'd rather speak to the inclusion and belonging piece.
Oh, of course.
That's okay. I think that this pandemic has set us back in a number of ways with the diversity, inclusion and belonging piece. And yet you'll see lots of research papers coming out now saying that we're making progress, particularly around BIPOC, or BAME as we call it in the UK.
Oh yeah, what does BAME stand for? I think it's a fascinating language choice.
Yeah, we have a different acronym this side of the pond.
So the US, we say BIPOC. So we were comparing notes before we hit record, and BIPOC is it's biracial, indigenous, or person of color. So sometimes the B gets used for black, though. So I have to be honest, our acronyms are always getting updated too. But BAME is the version used in the UK and more European. What does that stand for?
Black, Asian, minority, ethnicity. And there has been more of a spotlight placed on BAME in the UK workplace since the events of last May in the US, and since the latest and most powerful wave of the Black Lives Matter movement. So you will hear UK business leaders and analysts talking about the progress that's been made because more conversations have been started. And that's true. We saw some wonderful work coming from organisations last summer as they led their emergency responses to their employees and their BAME communities within the workplace, needing to feel more heard, needing to see more representation across the organisation, and especially in leadership. So I think from a recruitment perspective, there's a lot of progress being made. I think from a retention piece in terms of the organisation, less progress. There's a lot of fear amongst leaders that in order to bring in more representation and leadership, that they have to lose their job. Somebody's got to stand aside and make way for them. And this fear leads to denial, avoidance, and ultimately lack of behavioural change. And as a coach, I'm in the business of behavioural change. So we are not yet seeing enough organisations advancing the conversations and the processes and the policies and translating those into behavioural change. So taking the new and improved values of the organisation that embrace diversity, inclusion and belonging, and investing in their people's behavioural change. And often we're talking about reversing very deep-rooted beliefs and behaviours that go back to our childhood. So this is not easy work, and it's certainly not going to happen over a matter of months, but we have to commit to making that behavioural change.
Yeah. Behavior change is hard, and it's deeply rooted in everything we watch from the time we were little people, and what we learned from our parents. And sometimes, especially racial stereotypes, gender stereotypes, when you learn that as a young person and you think that's normal for 20, 30 years, and then now you're confronted with there are differences. We do see color, for example, or we do tend to think women are caregivers versus providers, all these biases that we've seen and experienced and exposed to our lives. Undoing some of that, that's really tough work. And I think to your point, Amanda, I'm seeing this in the States too, this overt focus on recruiting diverse talent. I just chuckle when the organization's like, oh, we're good. We're recruiting all these Black people. Like, really? That's your solution to this?
Yeah.
Because to your point, if you're not retaining them, what's the point? And so if you're not inclusive, of course, you're not going to retain them. If people don't feel seen, heard, and belong, people don't stay places they don't feel like they belong. So you have to really work on the I side of the equation, I would argue, before the D side of the equation, inclusion versus diversity. And they should go lockstep, hand in hand. Not to say you don't want to get better at recruiting, but you need to do it while building an inclusion. I'm curious, Amanda, you mentioned the events, obviously, of last summer with George Floyd here in the States, and subsequently, Black Lives Matter and other policing issues that we've experienced here in the States. I was so intrigued by the global response. For example, my husband is an English football fan, and so we watch, and they're still kneeling and wearing the Black Lives Matter representation on their jerseys. And I thought, wow, like, why would they care? I mean, honestly, I thought this was just something that we were experiencing in the States because of our awful racial history. Why is it that you think it took off global? Like, it resonates so much globally, even though it was a US isolated event?
I think purely and simply because those experiences resonate in other cultures. The UK is a very diverse population these days, and yet we still have some very deeply entrenched racial views amongst our neighbours and colleagues. You mentioned our English football league. Football is our national pride. It's our national sport. And
for Americans, that means soccer, by the way.
soccer, yeah. And we have so many players in our English soccer league that come from other parts of the world, and we have huge diversity in amongst our players and our teams and our clubs, and yet we you look at the makeup of the stadium, the fans, and there is a lot of racism there, and so our soccer players will call it out increasingly, and they will refuse to go on the pitch they'll refuse to continue playing if they are being booed at every time the ball gets passed to them. So we have our own problems, and we have the same problems, sadly.
It's a human issue, equality, right? I think whether you looked at George Floyd and saw a Black person or saw yourself as having a diverse experience and not feeling a sense of belonging, you're not feeling like you're treated fairly, you're right. I mean, sports is a really interesting place for diversity because there's so many more people of color, here in the States participate in our sports. And the same thing has happened. Mm-hmm. Some of our football teams getting booed when they, band together or kneel. And it's such a shame because the players are using the forum that they have to communicate and advocate, and they want to be supported. But much like y'all, and I've went to an English Premier League football game in Liverpool, so I can say,
oh, that's my team.
Oh, is it? Oh gosh, I have a whole bunch of Liverpool gear, not here in my office that I can show you, but my husband is a very huge fan. He's founded the local Liverpool soccer chapter here in our town and all sorts of stuff. He's the founding father of it. It's hilarious.
Amazing.
Anyway, we have noticed this though, and we have conversations about this, like how diverse the league is, because there's players from South America, Africa, all over. And it's beautiful that they're leveraging this platform for social change. I think it's extremely valuable. We see this a bit in our leagues. The National Basketball Association did a really nice job with it here in the States of letting players speak up and personalize their jerseys and such. But we need so many more voices coming to the conversation. And when you look around the sporting venues, although attendance is obviously limited now, it is very white. It is very male. Some sports have female participation here in the States, but it still skews male. It still skews very white. And I find that fascinating that you want to support them on the field, but not off the field. And that has to feel so harmful and so hurtful as a player.
Yeah, I'm reading Megan Rapinoe's autobiography at the moment. I got it for Christmas. Thank you, Santa. And it's very inspiring. I love Megan Rapinoe. I love Abby Wambach. I think
her book is tremendous too. Yeah, very vulnerable.
God, yeah. You've got some amazing female sports women who are using their platforms for good. Here in the UK, certainly women's football is not as big as it is, the women's soccer game in the US. One day we'll get there.
Well, it's refreshing to hear that because, Megan and Abby have been extreme advocates for women and the LGBTQ plus community and racially. Megan was one of the first to kneel after Colin Kaepernick, and she talks about that very openly, of the retaliation she got. Because as a white person, we're kind of taught not to stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters of color. And it's just, it's really interesting to think how much we don't see that and how much more we need to see of that. I appreciate
and a white woman.
As two white women here, right?
I speak up.
Right. We have to speak up with people of color. And I do workshops and podcasts with women of color from time to time, quite a bit. And it's just staggering how people react to our faces coming together. Because how often do you see that? How often do you see Black, brown, Black faces together side by side in solidarity? And what an opportunity we have to stand together visibly, whether it's on a Zoom screen for now or an infographic, but being there together, all together as humans. I hope we see more of that on the other side of all of this.
I hope so too.
Well, Amanda, it has been so delightful to talk with you today. I know you have an organization you're working with that, if you can tell our listeners a bit about, sounds phenomenal. It's called She Has No Limits. Tell us how that came to be.
Thank you, Julie. So my company is called Equal Talent, and in response to the impact that the pandemic has had on working women, we launched an emergency response movement last summer. We gave away free coaching. We organised a one-day virtual summit. We got 600 women onto one platform for live coaching, live panels, live networking. We had an award ceremony to celebrate female talent, and we have spun that out. So we now have a podcast. So I'm here with my learning head on, because you're a true podcasting pro, Julie. We are encouraging women not to wait for the coaching and training budgets to return from their employers, and to take responsibility for their own personal and professional development, and to design the careers that we deserve. We have seen so many millions of women being made redundant, being furloughed, being stuck at home, homeschooling the kids whilst trying to hold down their jobs, cooking, cleaning. We have been set back decades in terms of the gender equality movement. It is heartbreaking. So we had to do something, and that was our response. So I would love for any women who are out there who are either on the verge of jacking it all in career-wise, or who need a bit of help and encouragement and support from a community of like-minded women like them, all of whom are talented, ambitious, and want to have the careers that they deserve, to come and find us. We're at www.shehasnolimits.com.
Oh, what a beautiful story of courage and getting 600 women together. That's so powerful. And I think a lot of women think this is just happening to me. And just to realize how universal this is, as we're talking across the big pond, the Atlantic Ocean, these are things that my friends are sharing with me, highly educated, phenomenal women in the workplace that are thinking about leaving. I think last count in the US was 1 in 3 are thinking about leaving the workforce because of this, and many, many are. So on the other side of this, a chance to reinvent, a chance to think about what you design the career you really want on the other side of this. Not easy said as done. We need to address the systemic barriers as well, but there are tools like She Has No Limits to help with that. I'm thankful you're doing this work, Amanda.
Thank you.
Tell our listeners, how else can they stay in touch with you and follow your work?
Well, I am on a social media channel near you. So I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Equal Talent. My organisation also has a presence across those platforms. We have a Facebook community for leaders called Leading Through Change. They can come and join us there. But yeah, just reach out to me. I would love to have as many conversations about progress and change and gender equality and inclusion and belonging. There's work to be done, isn't there, Julie?
Oh, yeah, a lifetime. Lifetimes of work. I know this work won't be done in my lifetime or my kids' lifetime, unfortunately, but someday you're planting seeds for the future. We got to keep on keeping on. So thank you, Amanda, for being with us. You're such an inspiration. I appreciate you and your story.
You're welcome.
I appreciate you listening to this episode. If you like this podcast, the best way you can be an ally is to write a review on iTunes, on Spotify, on Google, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Every review helps other allies find us. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together as allies.